The next core concept is Laravel's service container. And this one is really important because it's basically the bedrock of the entire framework. Okay, so let's review it. But first, to help you understand, let's build our own container only as an example. It'll be really quick. Okay, so a service container is exactly what it sounds like. It's a container for services. It's a place to store and retrieve services. And by service, it's kind of a catch-all term for any kind of data. It could be a string, it could be a number, it could be an object, it could be a collection, anything you want. So here, again, only as a demo, we're going to delete this in a few minutes, but I've created a container class that I want to use. Now, if I go back to the routes file, let's toy around within our home route. I know that I want to instantiate that container. And let's now imagine how it should work. Well, if I want to store things, we could use any method we want. Put, add. As it turns out, Laravel uses a method called bind. So when we call bind, we need to give it a key and some kind of data that should be associated with it. So let's create one. In my app directory, I'm going to add a new class called example. There we go. And let's say, again, just for now, we're going to bind a key, example, and that's going to return whatever we need. So in this case, we're just instantiating that example class. But often, what it takes to instantiate the class is somewhat complex. Maybe there are 3 or 4 different dependencies. Maybe you have to read from a config file. So it's not always as simple as instantiate this. Imagine that for the demo, maybe there's a few objects that have to be instantiated in order to create an example instance. Okay, but anyways, this is how we want it to work. We instantiate container, and then we bind a key called example that will resolve to a new instance of this class. Okay, let's make it work. I'm going to dump our container, and I can use this DDD helper function in Laravel. So if I switch to Firefox, it's going to fail. And that's because there is no method bind on our container instance. Okay, we have our next step. So we're going to bind a key and some kind of value. We could call it data or value, anything is fine. So remember, a container stores services. So with that in mind, why don't we create a bindings array, and then when this method is called, I will push to our bindings array. We'll give it a key and a value. Okay, so now if we give it a refresh in Firefox, here's our object. We have our container along with one binding. Example is equal to a closure that is ultimately equal to a new instance of example. So how do we get access to that? All right, that's our next step. We could do a couple methods. We could even do an alias. So I like a simple method called get, but you could also do something like resolve or accept both, and one can be an alias for the other. Let's stick with resolve. I'm going to resolve example out of the container. And then we will dump this. Okay, let's come back and give it a refresh. And now that resolve method doesn't work. All right, we have our next step. So back to container. We need a new method called resolve. It will accept the key. And now we might say, well, if we have anything in the bindings array for that key, then return it. Return this bindings key. Okay, let's give that one a shot. So we come back and give it a refresh, and now we have our closure. But that's not quite right. I want whatever is returned from the closure. So let's trigger it or pass it to call user func. And now, if I come back and give it a refresh, we have our service. Finally, if you want to resolve a key that doesn't exist, you can do whatever you want. You can return false, you could throw an exception that there is no key in the container, anything you want. But this is the basic structure for a service container. Now, of course, Laravel's service container has many more bells and whistles, but this is the basic idea. You bind something into the container, and then later you can resolve it out of the container. So let's go to our example class, and we'll say go, and we'll say it works. All right, so if we go back to our routes file, now, of course, in real life, this sort of logic would not go in a route. More typically, it would go in what we call a service provider. And we'll talk about that more in a couple episodes. But anyways, at this point, we could say example, go. And if I come back to Firefox, refresh, it works. We bound a key into the container. This key will resolve to whatever we provide here, along with whatever constructor args or setters or configuration that we have to read. And that way, whenever we need it, we can resolve that key out of the container and we instantly have our object all set to go. Okay, so now that you understand the basics of a service container, let's delete all of this, and in the next episode, we'll review the real service container in Laravel.